There's a general duty to do as much good as we can. But when you find a particular person who's in need, right there in front of you, and you can immediately and directly help them, and you're face to face with them, you now have a special agent relative duty to save that person. And that duty, in my judgment, trumps the general duty to do as much good as we can.
I'm Katrine de Volder. This is the Practical Ethics Channel. Professor Larry Temkin, welcome to the Practical Ethics Channel.
Katrine, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for having me.
Peter Singer famously argued that just as we have compelling moral reason to save a drowning child from a shallow pond, so we have compelling moral reason to aid the world's needy. It doesn't make any moral difference that they're far away. But you question the relevance of Singer's famous pond example to determine our obligations to the needy, and in particular to our obligation to give to effective aid organizations. So why is that?
I've read Singer's example. I've been convinced by Singer's example. I've taught Singer's examples in my classes. I found it extremely powerful. And it is in many ways the foundations for some subset of the effective altruism movement. It's the foundation of that movement. And it's such a simple example. There's a child, they're drowning in the pond. You could help them at the cost of your needy clothes, your clothes. They'll get a little muddy. Maybe you'll have to throw them out. That's insignificant in comparison with the child's life. And so I agreed with Singer that, of course, we should save the child. And then the thought was supposed to be, from that, it follows that we ought also to save children on the other side of the world, because the mere fact that they're on the other side of the world does not seem to be morally relevant. But I've come to the view that there's this crucial bridge step he has. There's two key elements here. One is the claim that effective aid groups can help a child on the other side of the world just as easily as we can help a child drowning in the pond. And I'm no longer so sure that's so true. I also think that there's many disanalogies between the pond example and what goes on in that case and what goes on in the case when we send money to support an effective aid group. And these disanalogies, sadly, often have great normative significance.
Could you tell us a bit about what these disanalogies are?
I can, sure, I'd be happy to. Here's one disanalogy. When I save a child in a drowning pond, there's just two people involved, me and the child. And I know exactly what's going to happen in the example. I'm going to get my clothes muddy. But as a result, I save a drowning child. I save a life. Whereas when I send my check to a charity, there's a large number of intervening agents that stand between me and the actual delivery of whatever contribution I make. And these intervening agents, each one of them has a different chance to do something with my money. I'll send the money and it gets opened in an office in Boston. Somebody in Boston is deciding what will or won't be done with that money. They'll decide on the basis of consultations with a whole bunch of other people. At some point, the money will be put maybe into general operating expenses. Then the money might be used for any number of things. We can talk about that again in a minute. But maybe it goes overseas. Maybe it doesn't. If it does go overseas, then someone on the other end takes the money, and they're going to make decisions about what to do with that money. And when they make decisions about what to do with that money, they're going to be doing it on the basis of on-the-ground advice there, what they want to do, maybe government officials or other local agents that they have to interact with, whose cooperation they need. Maybe at some point it buys supplies. At that point, some driver picks up those supplies and takes them maybe to some village. Perhaps at that point it's delivered into the hands of someone else. And maybe only at that point does a nurse or some other person, a food distributor, actually get the proceeds of what I contributed to the people most in need. And the point is, there's many points here, but one point is that every one of these independent agents is a possibility for something to go awry. A possibility for the money that I sent for one reason to end up being used for another reason, sometimes for nefarious reasons and sometimes not. So that's one of the disanalogies. I mean, to go back to the non-nefarious reasons. I mean, when I make a contribution, the aid agencies are always saying, send us your money, we're going to save a life. But actually, they have, as we all know, a host of expenditures. And they're going to send some of that money to, some of that money might be used just to pay the rent. Or it might, the rent for an office in Boston. Or it might be used for fundraising costs, or mailing costs, or stamp costs. These are all perfectly legitimate uses. I mean, there's no reason why you might not want to support such uses. But that's not the same as saving a life. The analogy is supposed to be, if you have a moral obligation to save a life, then you should save the child from the drowning pond and you should give to an effective charity. But there seems intuitively to be a big difference between the moral obligation to save a life and the moral obligation to buy stamps for flyers that will solicit funds. The second may be very valuable, but the idea that the obligation to buy stamps for flyers or to pay for someone's salaries or to pay for gas to fill a truck is the same and directly follows from the obligation to save a child that's drowning in a pond, I don't think that follows. Let me say a little bit about some of the concerns that I have. They're directly relevant to what many people do with Singer's Pond example, and that's to move to something like effective altruism. Now, many of the people watching this might know what effective altruism is, but many might not. Effective altruism is a rather large, somewhat amorphous group of people who want people to do good. And they want people to do good as effectively as possible and in the most effective manner. So they recognize there are many charities out there and many charities that are doing good work. But their view is that if you can give money to a charity, you should give money to those charities that are doing the most important work and that are most effectively doing the most important good work. So this is very much an approach that in essence says, insofar as we want to aid the needy, we want to do the most good that we can. Now, I actually, for much of my life, have been a supporter of this kind of move. I think it's more important, for example, that we give aid to help people who are going to die of starvation than that we give aid to beautify the local park. Though a good idea and important and valuable, it's not as important as saving lives. So there's a big kernel of truth to this. When you give, you want to do as much good as you can. But the thing is, I'm more concerned about how does a decent human being respond in the world to the fact that there are people in need. And I don't think the answer to that question, how does a decent human being respond to people who are in need, is just the same as they do whatever will do the most good. So let me give an example related to the pond example. Suppose I'm walking by a pond. I see this child drowning in the pond. And I'm wearing a very fancy watch. It's very expensive. I don't own such a watch, but pretend I am. Maybe it's a $5,000 watch, 5,000 pound watch. It's very expensive. But because it's so expensive, it has this very intricate clasp, makes it very difficult to remove in a quick manner as a safety mechanism. I see that child who's drowning in the pond, and I realize if I don't jump in right away, the child's going to die. I say to myself, immediately, the first thought is, I must jump in and save the child. And then this thought jumps into my mind, but I'm wearing this incredibly expensive watch. It's like $5,000. If I jump in, it's going to ruin the watch. And then I have this third thought, and the third thought is that watch, its value is insignificant in comparison with the child's life. And so I think, I've got to save the child. I've got to jump in and save the child. Suppose just as I'm about to do that, I have a fourth thought. And the fourth thought is, oh my gosh, this is a really valuable watch. If I take this watch, I could take it to a very effective charity. I could give it to them, I could sell it, give the proceeds to them, and they could save 3 children on the other side of the world who are no less deserving than this child. They're just as innocent, they're just as valuable morally, they're no less deserving. Suppose I have that fourth thought, and I choose to act on it. There's no sense sitting there watching the drowning child die, so I call 911. In America, that's what we do. It's an emergency number. I report the location of the child. I say, if you show up here in 5 minutes, you will find a child floating dead in the water. And then I go on to work. Later that week, I sell my watch. I actually give it to an effective charity. And sometime later down the road, 3 innocent children are saved. Now, it's my view that if I do that, there's something wrong with me, and there's something wrong about what I do. And if you don't mind, I'll just tell you a little bit about those 2 elements. So I think there's something wrong with me because I don't think I should have ever even had that fourth thought. I mean, the first thought was the appropriate one. I need to save the drowning child. The second thought is okay. You know, if I save the drowning child, I'm going to ruin my watch. You can't help but think that. Of course you're going to have that thought. But then that third thought was, that's insignificant in comparison with the life of the child. That's where it should have ended. I should have saved the child. And my reasons for this is because a decent human being is going to have a whole bunch of virtues. Virtues of caring, virtues of compassion, virtues of generosity, virtues of sympathy, which are going to be elicited in the face-to-face confrontation between one human being and another. I believe that it's in the face-to-face confrontation between one human being and another that the kind of human beings that we are formed and revealed. And I believe a virtuous person faced with a drowning child in need will jump in, even if they could have done more good by doing something else elsewhere. And I also believe that there's a certain kind of duty that arises. There's a general duty of beneficence to aid the needy. There's a general duty to do as much good as we can. But when you find a particular person who's in need, right there in front of you, and you can immediately and directly help them, and you're face to face with them, you now have a special agent relative duty to save that person. And that duty, in my judgment, trumps the general duty to do as much good as we can. So I think that a good and decent person would not let the child drown and then sell the watch later to save 3 children elsewhere, not because they wouldn't be doing more good, but there's more to morality than just doing the most good that you can. I want to talk briefly about the topic of dramatic rescues or natural disasters. When someone is lost at sea, miners are trapped underground. You have a tsunami and the whole world pitches in and people come over and people are still digging through the rubble, sometimes with their bare hands, but sometimes with equipment, a week later, hoping to find one more person still alive. If you're trying to figure out what we should do just based on cost-effective analysis, that's all just a waste of money. It's not cost-effective to have lots of people digging through the rubble a week after the earthquake on the off chance you'll save one more life. You could save far more people by diverting those resources elsewhere. And yet, to me, to my mind, decency, humanity, the common humanity that we show, when we all come together, we live in such a divided world. In so many ways, politically and religiously, and there's so many different divides. And these are moments where we all come together and we share a common humanity for those people who have been hit by the natural disaster, the earthquake, the tsunami, etc. There's something very uplifting about that, very inspiring about that. Dramatic rescues give voice to the recognition that every single human being has a value that you can't really put a price on. And this is something which only paying attention to the cost effectiveness of it loses sight of.
Do you also think that the effective altruism movement is misguided in encouraging us to donate to effective aid groups instead of working in a soup kitchen, for example?
So great question. So misguided, I think, isn't quite the way I want to put it, but there's something close to that. Now, you have to understand, I want to be clear here, actually. Effective altruism is not, as it were, my target. They're not an enemy. They're, as it were, I want to say, on the side of the angels. The effective altruists, and I know many of the people involved in the movement, I know many of them well, and I consider many of them dear friends. They're seeking something which I think is crucially important. But I do think that sometimes the advice they give is narrow. It has this narrow monistic approach of do the most good you can. Suppose you're a high-powered executive who gets paid, $500 an hour. But you also have a big heart and you want to help people in need. One of the things you do is you give a bunch of money to charity, effective aid groups. But you also go out every weekend and you go to the soup kitchen and you ladle soup. I know effective altruists who have published on this topic and said that's a waste of money. It's a waste of time. It's an ineffective way for you to act. What you ought to do is, instead of going to the soup kitchen and personally ladling out soup for 6 hours, what you ought to do is work those 6 hours, make it extra. I said $500 an hour is times 6, so if I did that right, it'll be $3,000. Make an extra $3,000. Hire a couple of people in your place to work for the soup kitchen that you could hire for $15 an hour or $50 an hour. Take the rest of the proceeds, send it to an effective charity. The people in the soup kitchen will still be fed just as well by the other people taking your place that you've paid for. It's just not you who's doing it. You've made all this extra money, which can now be sent to an effective charity, and you could save more lives. That's clearly the thing you should do. If the only thing that matters is doing the most good that you can do, then that is clearly the thing that you should do. But again, I think there's more to being a good person than being a do-gooder. There's more to being a good person and having the courage to go down and meet people in need, face to face, again, face to face, and relate one human being to another, and do more than just write your check. That has a value that's not captured by this picture that just says, oh, well, that's a waste of money.
So is the life of a philosopher who devotes all her time to her work not a good life?
So it's interesting you say that, because the life of a philosopher who devotes all the time to her work might well be a good life. But I suspect if you really want to push me hard on it, I'll probably say, maybe not. And I know such philosophers, and some of them I love dearly. I mean, my mentor, my teacher, person who helped me along the most in philosophy and in many ways outside of philosophy was Derek Parfit. He had this amazing devotion to the life of the mind, the following the arguments where the arguments lead. And he was a very generous man, an unbelievably generous man, generous with his students and generous in giving to the needy and so on and so forth. But it was, to a very large extent, all about the work for Derek. I admired Derek unbelievably. I mean, I wouldn't say I worshipped him, but it's very hard to describe how much I admired and loved Derek Parfit. I was his first PhD student. He was my teacher, advisor, mentor, and friend. But I don't think he lived a good life. I mean, in some ways it was a great life, an inspiring life, an unbelievable life. And he made contributions to the world that most of us would never be able to make. So there are many respects in which it was a good life, but I wouldn't want that life for one of my children.
Aren't there already too many people who are trying to be a good person by helping the people they're close to? And don't we need more effective altruists, even if they're in some sense less good than those who focus on helping the nearest and dearest?
Don't we need more effective altruists? Well, this gets into a really important question. This gets into the question of what are effective altruists actually trying to do? There's a very famous economist named Angus Deaton. He's the 2015 Nobel laureate in economics. Angus thinks that the presupposition of your question is wrong-headed, that the exact reverse is the case, that in many of the most desperate places on earth, there are aid groups after aid groups after aid groups falling on top of each other. And if you visited places like Kenya and Ethiopia and elsewhere, as I have, you will see that. You will get off at the airport and you will see sort of one aid group and another aid group and another aid group and another aid group. And the sad reality is very often when aid money pours in to help the needy people who are the victims of social injustice, some of that sometimes a shockingly, surprisingly large amount, ends up being siphoned off in any one of a number of ways into the very perpetrators of the injustice in the first place. And this enables those perpetrators of these terrible social injustices to continue to perpetrate social injustices against such people and against other people. And it incentivizes other despots in those regions and other regions to act in similar ways. He also believes, Angus does, that massive infusions of aid decreases the dependency of a government on taxing its people. They get their money from all these aid groups that are coming in. If you're getting your money from the aid groups that are getting in, you don't have to be responsive to the people of the country. You have to be responsive to the aid groups. That's not the same thing. If that's the case, these people don't have to be responsive to the people. And the people can't insist that their money be used wisely because they're not the one paying the taxes. They're not the one supporting the government agendas. So the actual worry is that though you say, aren't too many people being selfish? I actually think the answer to that question is, in one sense, yes. On the other hand, there still may be too many people putting money in places where it ends up supporting corrupt regimes or irresponsible regimes or regimes that are unresponsive to their people, enabling this condition of people being in need to persist for generations. And that's a very, very bad thing.
So do you think that we better stop giving money to effective aid organizations because of the concern you just expressed?
So I'm not prepared to do that yet. I'm not prepared to suggest that yet. I do think that we should be looking more carefully at what aid organizations we're giving to. Angus famously says that our concern should be to aid needy people, not to aid needy countries. A disproportionate amount of aid goes to the poorest countries in the world. But a overwhelmingly large proportion of the people who are actually needy live in, for example, India and China. Plenty of needy people. Plenty of needy people right here in the UK, and plenty of needy people in the United States, where I come from, and in Canada and many other places. And sometimes these needy people are refugees, and sometimes they're immigrants, and sometimes they're minorities, and sometimes they're just people who suffer from severe mental or physical illnesses. There are lots and lots of needy people who could use our help. And many of the kinds of worries I've been raising about corruption and about unresponsive governments, these are particular worries in some of the poorest regions of the world where a certain amount of aid that pours in becomes a disproportionate amount of the overall GDP, of the overall operating expenses of the government. If we gave the same amount of money that we give to some of the poorest countries in Africa, to China, it would be an insignificant blip in the total amount of income that they get each year. So it wouldn't have the same distortional effects. And yet there are plenty of needy people in China that we could help with such money. And plenty of needy people in India and Pakistan that we could help with such money, even though these are not the poorest countries in the world. So if I were literally just concerned about doing the most good I could, I would probably still be trying to give to effective aid agencies, but probably not the ones that are currently being promoted, or not necessarily all of those. There might be other ones that need our attention in perhaps other countries where some of these worries wouldn't arise. But now a big caveat. I said earlier that I thought there was something noble about the dramatic rescues. Here's someone lost at sea, and we expend all these resources to try to save them, with the miners trapped underground. We know they're there, and we know they're alive. We know we could do more good if we just let them die. We took those tremendous resources and then we spent them somewhere else. On a hospital in the same city. But we don't. We save those people who are in desperate need now, and we can do it. Though it doesn't do the most good. I'm not prepared to write off the people, the poorest people in the world, just because if we help them, we won't be doing the most good that we can. They need our help now. So what I would like to see is collectively combined efforts to help the people who need the help now. But I would like to see a lot more attention paid to global reforms of the social, political, and economic systems that reward and enable dictators and repressive governments to flourish in these countries. I'm not arguing we should be bringing about regime change. We've seen that sounds like a great idea. It doesn't work in practice very well. But I do think that we have a global and economic order in place, which to a large extent benefits the wealthiest country and the wealthiest people in the world at the expense of the poorest people in the poorest nations. What I do fear is that just going in year to year to help the needy people in the poorest country without making fundamental changes to the order, which enables repressive governments and governments that have social injustices of the sort I've described that create these many needy people. If we don't do something to change that, then this will be a problem that just never goes away. We're just going to be helping needy people and then helping more needy people and helping more needy people.